Okay, hi everybody. It is Friday afternoon, and that macro paper is getting a little closer with each passing hour. So I thought we'd spend half an hour or so really zooming in on a couple of key fiscal policy topics today. We've got my presentation, but also we've got the support of hundreds of students live in the group today. As always, a fantastic turnout, and we're guaranteed some amazing responses. So the chat window will be the place for where amazing things can happen, particularly in some of the questions I'm going to pose to you ahead of the fiscal policy session. Let's make a start, because there's lots to cover, and I can't cover everything, but a little glimpse there of my brother in the top corner who's producing this session for us today. I've tried to pick out some areas that I think are really important. So the significance of the size of fiscal deficit and debt, clearly that's got to be a major topic, hasn't it? As particularly post-pandemic. Government spending, different levels of government spending, the impact of government spending and taxation on various macroeconomic variables. And what I thought I'd just change it a little bit today. I've got a couple of 25 mark questions for the group as a whole, just to have a quick look at in terms of what you put into different sides of the argument. So that's to come in about 10, 15 minutes. Hopefully in this session as well, lots of application, lots of good data for you. You won't forget it. If you learn it now, it'll still be with you come Monday afternoon if you get a question on fiscal policy. Of course, if you get a data response question, use the data in the extracts. But if you get an essay question, well, it's a chance to show off your economics. Let's make a start with our favorite bubble quiz, just to get people in the mood on this festive, celebratory Friday afternoon. So with the bubble quiz, I pose a question to you, and there can either be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 correct answers. Here we go. Let's see who's up to speed. Which of these UK taxes brings in more than 100 billion a year in revenue? What do we think? Post the answers in the chat window. This is the system designed for AQA, OCR, and Edexcel, all the boards. Alex has gone for A and D. Ewan thinks it's all 4 of them. A couple more. Freddie Garfoot thinks it's B, C, and D. Olivia thinks it's A, C, and D. And Ria thinks it's B and D. John V thinks it's A, C, D. And Bavia thinks it's A, D, C. Same answer. Here we go. Let's check. Well done. Quite a cluster of correct answers there. So fantastic start, everybody. Yeah, national insurance, VAT, and income tax are the biggest 3 taxes by some distance. Corporation tax brings in about £1 billion a week. In fact, if we look at this slide, I've just put a little chart together on the next slide. If you might want to take a screenshot here for your revision notes, those were the tax revenues last year, which does include a part of the year of the pandemic, but income tax just under 200 billion, national insurance 144, VAT 117. Those are the 3 big ones, aren't they? Then corporation tax, council tax, things like duties on tobacco and other taxes. So those are the biggest taxes in the UK. We'll come back to this in a few minutes. Here's our second question. In 2020, which of these countries had a level of government spending, total public sector spending, if you like, of more than half their GDP? So I'm looking here for some examples of countries where government spending is pretty high as a share of GDP. What do we reckon? Which of these countries had more of more than 50% of GDP? Olivia thinks B and D. Khalik thinks A and D. Interesting. Ben Smith's just gone for A. Dominic Rose thinks B and C. And Fatima thinks A and B. Seth Aggiano thinks A, B, D. And Sonny thinks A, B, D as well. Let's check the answer. It's A and D. Actually, government spending in India and Ireland is quite a long way below 50%. They're not very high government spending countries. For one reason, in India, of course, they don't necessarily have a very wide-ranging welfare system. France, always very high, one of the highest, closer to 60% and 50%. The UK, of course, went above 50% in 2020, in part because government spending went up and GDP went down. So hence that lifted it above the 50% threshold. Here's another bubble quiz question for you, just to get us warmed up. Which of these countries in 2021 had a national debt below 30% of GDP? What do we reckon? Yeah, absolutely. Alex saying they didn't spend, they're expecting to spend nearly £1 trillion, I think, in 2021, which is staggering. Which of these countries had a national debt below 30% of GDP? Cormac thinks it's C and D. Amber thinks it's defo, not A. Amber, yeah, I think you're right. Jack thinks C and D, and Bruce thinks C. Dom Rose thinks C and D. And by the way, I like the use of the word defo. Good succinct use of characters there. Let's have a look at the answers. It's defo, not Greece, Italy, or Hong Kong. It's Australia. Australia had a national debt of 25% of GDP. Hong Kong a bit above. Italy well above 100%. Of course, Greece 190%, the highest debt of any European country. Japan lies above it. One more. Here we go. How about this one? In 2021, which of these countries had a zero rate of tax on corporate profits? Okay, what do we reckon? How many of those 4 countries had a zero corporation tax rate? And the 4 countries are Ireland, Qatar, UAE, and the Bahamas. That'd be one heck of a qualifying group if that was the FIFA World Cup. What do we reckon? Okay, answers coming through. Freddie thinks D. Alex and Fatima both think B and C. And Seth thinks B, C, D. That's interesting. B, C, D. Let's look at the answers. The answer is C and D. Now, those are 2 great examples to put into your, if you get a question on globalization and tax competition between nations, the UAE and the Bahamas both have a zero corporation tax. In Qatar, it's 9%, pretty low. The Ireland figure is 12.5%, or it is at the moment. Okay, so moving on. Just a bit of exam gold. I'd like to sprinkle a little bit of exam gold. Corporation tax could well be, I'm not predicting it, but it could well be a hot topic. It's been in the news for so long, and there's been a whole debate about whether this race to the bottom in corporation taxes could be stopped. OECD countries, that's the group of leading advanced high-income nations. They agreed last year in principle to introduce a common minimum corporation tax of 15%. But that's actually going to be delayed. So in theory, they're going to bring 15% in, which obviously Ireland have to adjust to. Would just affect Ireland of those countries listed. But that's actually going to be delayed for at least a year. It's one of those things that might not actually happen. The big news for the UK, which you definitely need to know for the exam, is that the UK government has already announced a 6 percentage point rise from 19 to 25%, spread over 5 years for corporation tax paid by large companies that make more than £250,000 a year in profit. And that's quite an important change in the corporate tax system. It's going to take the UK up to sort of corporate tax levels equivalent to South Korea and Spain. Keep those thoughts in mind ahead of your exam on Monday, quite important. Over to you. Here's the first of our quick questions. We give ourselves 30 seconds, and we'd love to see amazing answers in the chat window because this is a special group of economists. Give me reasons, please, why the UK budget deficit increased during the pandemic. 30 seconds. Okay, yeah, some good answers there. Henrik talks about the blank check to the NHS. Henrik might have been watching a video from a well-known YouTuber with that phrase, but certainly a very valid point. I picked out that Ted talked about automatic stabilizers and Cigar mentioned the furlough scheme, but Henrik's gone way over budget there. He's got lots of great points in there. So yeah, let's quickly go through my points. Cormac talks about PPE. Increased government spending on NHS and welfare. I would put together those kind of. Obviously spending went up in general terms, but it was a lot of extra spending on the NHS. It wasn't actually a blank check, by the way, but it was demand-driven spending. It's the best way. That's the phrase to use. Welfare went up, of course. Wage subsidies, the furlough scheme, other support for businesses was one factor. There were then temporary cuts in tax. They cut VAT to 5% for hotels and travel and tourism. And crucially, this is the really important point if this comes up on Monday, the recession, GDP, I think Olivia mentioned that real GDP fell by 9.4%, spot on. So GDP went down, so automatically government spending goes up as a share of GDP, increasing the deficit. But tax revenues fell as well, and that is due to the automatic stabilizers, which we talked about in our session yesterday on economic cycles. So some great answers there, well done. Just picking up on that, I think that I just want to say a little bit about fiscal policy during the pandemic. So there's no question that what you have in 2020, 21, to a lesser extent this year, is one of the biggest examples of classic Keynesian fiscal stimulus policies. Fiscal policy was extremely expansionary during the pandemic. I mean, it had to be, because the aim was very simple. The aim was to support aggregate demand and prevent a deflationary depression. And somebody yesterday, when we did a session on growth and things, talked about economic scarring. Tremendous point. The idea that recessions can actually have longer lasting economic and social effects. My own view, and it can be debated, of course, but it might be a good evaluation point, is that fiscal policy this time had a bigger macro impact than monetary policy. Don't forget, interest rates were cut from 0.75% to 0.1%, only about 0.5% decrease. QE expanded, yes. It was fiscal policy that did most of the heavy lifting during this period. And it's always good to go into the exam with some applied examples. What I've done on the next slide for you is just give you some good examples. You might want to take a screenshot of this. Don't forget, you can download the presentation pretty much straight away after the live session today. It'll be in our live 222.live, 222.net/live. Then go to student events, replays, and you can get the presentation. So job retention scheme, £70 billion on furlough, 70 billion. I've done a video, by the way, evaluating the furlough scheme. Might be worth checking out on YouTube. There could be a question, assess the impact of things like wage subsidy on the UK economy. Extra funding for the NHS, direct funding, business rate holidays, universal credit went up £20 a week. Of course, they took it away again, which is politically controversial. VAT was cut. They also froze duties on alcohol and fuel, so the real duty went down. Everybody mentions eat out to help out. You know, if you ask 10 economists on Monday, 12 of them will have mentioned eat out to help out. And my strong advice, by the way, is to pick better examples than that, because it wasn't really that significant, but it obviously hit the headlines. There were also lots of direct grants to small businesses affected, like cinemas and theatres, etc. And the arts got about £1.5 billion. So there we go. There's some good examples of what happened. This chart is really interesting. It basically explains why the deficit went up, because the fiscal deficit, everybody, is just the difference between two enormous numbers. How much the government spends in orange, that went up. And somebody mentioned over £1 trillion of government spending, versus how much the government takes in tax, and that went down, the blue line. So the gap is the fiscal deficit. And you can see before the pandemic, the British government was pretty close to balancing the budget, and then their fiscal rules were just blown apart within the space of a few weeks and a few months. That chart is really interesting. Moving on. Just a bit of background on the fiscal deficit. I think it's important to go into the exam with the key numbers. So if it's okay with you, let's just spend 30 seconds on the key numbers. So last year, the year which included the first major lockdown and then the shutdowns, the UK government borrowed £318 billion. It's almost £1 billion a day, almost. Do the maths. It's 15% of GDP. By the way, the examiners, if you were to say in the exam, the UK government borrowed over 300 billion, nearly 15% of GDP. They're not going to fact check everything you say, but that kind of number really does impress. It's a peacetime record. It's certainly the biggest budget deficit in my lifetime. And as many of you know, I was around in the Great Depression. That 318 billion is about £4,800 per person, put in context. Okay, and then the next slide shows the debt. Because obviously if you're borrowing more, your debt goes up. Particularly if GDP is going down, your debt as a share of GDP must go up. So at the end of 2021, public sector net debt was just over £2 trillion. That's just under 100% of GDP. Some students having their revision notes is above 100%. It just depends if you include the debt of the banks the government owns and the debts of local authorities and that kind of thing. But it's basically gone up from about 85% to 95% of GDP. It's pretty large. It's about 32,000 grand per person. Crucially, and this is a stat which I think you can genuinely use in evaluation. Based on that figure, the government was spending about £800 million a week just in interest. Although in net terms it's less because a lot of the debt is owned by the Bank of England through quantitative easing. So a lot of the government interest payments go to the Bank of England rather than leave the economy. So net interest payments, 24 billion. National debt, question came in, national debt. So what is national debt as a percentage of GDP mean? Thanks for your question, Ella, really appreciate it. It just means the amount of accumulated debt that the government has. Thanks, there's a question from Ella. Accumulated debt measured as a percentage of the size of the economy. It's debt that hasn't yet been repaid. If you want an interesting statistic, the average duration of debt is about 14 years for the UK. The UK government can borrow long term, 10, 15, 20 years. A lot of this debt that they've issued in the last year or two won't have to be repaid until, well, probably 10 years time, minimum. Okay, crucial. Now let's move on to a little tweak in how we run these sessions, because your answers are so good. I just thought I'd challenge you a little bit with two questions. And what I've tried to do here is think about AQA, OCR, NXL, think about some generic 25-mark questions and get us to brainstorm some points. Let me just read the extract for you. The UK government raises about £800 billion per year from tax. That's 37% of GDP is tax. Big ones, national insurance, income tax and VAT. Recent increases in taxes have contributed to the highest tax burden since the 1950s. Here's the question. Evaluate the consequences for the UK economy of a significant increase in the tax burden. So here's our first challenge. Can you please, moving on to the next slide. Can you please pop into the chat window arguments that you would use here that a higher tax burden would be damaging to the UK economy? Please have a go. Okay, some good answers coming through, and thanks to our production team for selecting a few. Apologies, we can't put everything on the screen. There's a great one from Maurice: wealth traps, lower consumption, less disposable income, lower quality of life. Of course, you could make a great answer there. And Gina: tax burdens can be aggressive for current and future generations, decrease productivity for businesses and reduce living standards. These points, you can build tremendous answers. Somebody actually said to me in the chat, what's the tax burden? It's just basically all the taxes taken together divided by GDP. All the taxes divided by GDP. Sadia says it could lead to corporations relocating, multinational corporations relocating elsewhere where tax is lower. Hey, that's a tremendous point. Well done. Maybe we can find one more. There's so many coming through. Do keep an eye on the chat window, those watching live. We've got over 500 people in the group this afternoon watching live. Some amazing answers coming through. Becky talks about brain drain and FDI being de-incentivized. Here's Oscar's point. Decreases economic growth, AD shifts to the left and reduction in investment, firms have less profit. This is quite a few people mentioning the Laffer curve, which is quite interesting. Okay, well, here's my answer. Conscious of time here because we're going to stick to the time. Now, a couple of people talked about higher taxes being a consequence of higher taxes. Some of you might have been misreading the question, saying higher government debt or borrowing will be damaging. This question is really quite specific. Arguments that a higher tax burden will be damaging. So in other words, taxation as a share of GDP is going up. Is that damaging? Here's my 3 points. There are many more, though, you could put. Tax rises reduce real disposable incomes, leading to a fall in consumption, and that risks causing another recession. We could have a double-dip recession. I'd love you to put in your answer real disposable income. That tells the examiner you know exactly what the effects of direct taxes are. Now, my second point is points some people made. Higher taxes make the UK less attractive for inward FDI and might lower domestic investment. You then develop that point and talk about the impact on aggregate supply and productivity and exports and things. And crucially, the increase in the tax burden may fall heavily on lower income families, therefore could be regressive. Of course, that depends on which taxes go up, but it could also hit work incentives in that, you can put those 2 points together and maybe discourage people from working. Ashwini talks about the reverse multiplier, which is fantastic. Juliet says, "How I wish this is a 25 marker." Well, let's all say a little prayer that something similar to this maybe comes up. Yeah, some great points here. We actually got somebody in the chat called Daddy Jeff. I am blessed to have such amazing followers on YouTube. Actually, a really good point made there about skilled labour, leaving countries to get better wages in other countries. Okay, let's do a bit of evaluation. I've got 2 of these questions for you. Over to you. Fantastic start. Can you think of counter arguments that a higher tax burden will necessarily be damaging to the UK? Let's see what you can come up with in the next 30 seconds. Daniel Piper is probably Daniel looks like he's like a 3rd-year undergrad at this point. Ricardian equivalence for evaluation of direct taxes? Yes, maybe not on the spec, but my word, that would be a great point. The Ricardian equivalence is the idea that the whole idea of is today's borrowing tomorrow's taxes and things, and the tax burden across different generations. Quite interesting. But don't worry, that's not a part of the spec for those other people. Noah Griffiths talks about higher fiscal dividend for governments, more spending on public services, better education, more skilled workers, more productive. PPF shifts out. Nice change of reasoning there. Alex, just pause on Alex's point here. Higher taxation can be used for greater public sector capital investment. Now, that's a really good point, Alex. I would then apply that with a specific example. Crossrail 2 or HS3, for example, or the what have you, who knows? Lisa, Laffer curve can reduce inflation, increase government revenue. 3 nice points there. I'm conscious here in 30 seconds you're typing like the wind, so you don't have to flesh out the chains of reasoning. There's one from Sean. If firms relocate, I think Sean's referring to TNCs and MMCs, can cause higher unemployment, so an increase in government spending. Absolutely right. So the danger. Oh, actually, that could actually be an argument. Yeah, actually, that was an argument for the first one, wasn't it? And then he comes back talking about the extra revenue can be spent on public services. Luke says, allows redistribution to those of lowest socioeconomic position, increase government spending on key areas, lowers the national debt. So you need to raise taxes now to lower the debt. Congratulations, team. We've got one more to come on a very topical issue. Let me just run you through my points. Again, these are not meant to be exhaustive, but just thoughts I had typing this up. So the counter arguments that a higher tax burden will be damaging. One, you need taxes now to reduce the fiscal deficit. Something's got to give. We've had a huge increase in spending, a massive increase in the fiscal deficit. It's important to control the deficit now, to control the debt over the next few years, because in the future that might allow tax cuts. It's a little bit like the argument I made yesterday, which is that the Bank of England should be raising interest rates now so that it can cut them in the future if it needs to. And there's a little phrase here, a little homily, that you should always mend the roof when the sun's shining, not when there's a thunderstorm. That maybe the government should be taking steps to improve their public finances over the next 3 or 4 years, because who knows what's going down the line. Second point, tax burdens or taxes have a purpose. Those extra revenues can be funding public services, education, NHS, social care, can link it to demography, social housing. We only built 6,000 social houses last year. Local authority social housing, 6,000. I think we missed a couple of noughts off. And the environmental spending is going up, of course. And then crucially, this is a kind of an analytical point, that tax rises, if you reduce the deficit by raising tax, it might be less negative for growth than if you cut government spending by the same amount. Here's my argument. Bear with me on this. Let's say you raise tax by 20 billion across different taxes. The alternative is to cut government spending by 20 billion to get the same effect on the deficit. But people would have saved some of that tax anyway. So the impact on aggregate demand is less than if you make deep cuts in government spending. And many people look back to those 6 or 7 years of austerity after the last recession and think how damaging that was as we entered the latter part of the last decade. Okay, moving on. Conscious of time, here's our second question. We've got 2 or 3 minutes left in our session. In 2021, the UK fiscal deficit was 318 billion, 14.8% of GDP, which is a record. And basically what I've done is I've just given you the data again, haven't you, that we talked about earlier on in the session. So at the end of 2021, government debt was 2.1 trillion, or 94% of the size of the economy. Here's our question. To what extent should a high level of government borrowing be a cause for concern? 25 marks. Here's your first challenge. If you choose to accept it, can you throw in, please, your best arguments that a high level of government borrowing should be a cause for concern? Over to you. Some great answers coming through, and thanks to Jim for being so professional and picking out some superb points. Notice how many people mentioned crowding out, so it looks like you're all revising that. Matthew talks about crowding out of the private sector, and Detsky talks about may cause government failure due to misallocation of resources. Abisha talks about intergenerational inequality. Wow. Jay talks about high deficit may be unsustainable for future generations, linking to Abisha's point there. And lots of points coming through. Our live chat is a little bit delayed because we try and slow things down. So some great points still coming through. Henrik's back again. High borrowing may increase government's interest rates, causing financial crowding out. A high burden for future generations. Yeah, we're in good shape, I think. Albie, one of our regular contributors, talks about financial crowding out. Reduce business confidence. In other words, if businesses might become worried that they're going to have to bear the burden of the higher borrowing and taxes in the future, and that could lead to a Greek-style situation. Presumably, Albie suggesting that the Greeks made a complete massacre of their fiscal policy. Beware Greeks bearing debt, I was always told. Yeah, let's look at my points. And then we'll have one more counter one. Okay, so what did I put? These are arguments that high government borrowing should be a cause for concern. First of all, borrowing adds to debt. You could use the data, of course, in the extract for application, which leads to increased interest payments. And there's an opportunity cost. Money, the billions spent on interest, could be spent on social care, might be spent on improved roads, education, healthcare, and so on. Crowding out makes an appearance. The rise in borrowing leads to higher interest rates in markets for loanable funds, and that can lead to a form of financial crowding out as businesses have to pay more for their loans as well. Now, a lot of people are saying, what is crowding out? Well, a lot of you clearly understand what it is. We do have a video on crowding out. So Janine's mentioned this and Janine's mentioned it. We do have a video. Very quickly, when the government borrows money, huge amounts, it goes to the market for loanable funds, and sells bonds. Now, the more that it's selling of those bonds, the lower the price will be in theory, and therefore the higher is the interest rate on those bonds. And those interest rates, that tends to cause interest rates generally in the market for loanable funds to go up. And not just the government needs to borrow money, it could be big corporations, it could be households in the mortgage market that needs to borrow money. So if the government's a major borrower, it tends to drive up the cost of borrowing money, which then has ripple effects on businesses. So businesses may find it more expensive to fund that much needed loan, for example. So the idea is if the government borrows more, it can squeeze the private sector and reduce investment. The alternative is the government taxes more, in which case the private sector also pays those taxes. But there is a special video on crowding out. If you go to our YouTube site, just type in GDTU crowding out, you'll find a video on that, I think. Surge in borrowing risks causing accelerating inflation. So, of course, this huge rise in government borrowing, 15% of GDP, in theory, could cause a rise in inflation. So it depends on the output gap, but that has costs. That has economic and social costs. By the way, the chat is unbelievably good. I mean, they're so supportive of each other, which is amazing. So thank you for that. It's just incredible to watch all these economists coming together, answering each other's questions. Just very quickly, we can't answer every point that's made in chat. If you have a specific question on fiscal policy, stick it in the comments section of the YouTube video, and we'll do our best tonight. I'll be going in tonight for an hour or so, answering as many questions as possible, or putting some links in to some videos or resources. So please use the comment section if you're feeling a bit frustrated we're not picking your answer out. Let's do a bit of evaluation. This could be amazing, judging what we've just had. 30 seconds, counter arguments that a high level of government borrowing should be a cause for concern. Over to you. Okay, can we? Amber's point is brilliant. If we can keep that on the screen, and thank you for this one, Amber. It stimulates GDP, as suggests a fiscal stimulus, which may cause I would add that cause a positive fiscal multiplier effect and prevent recession. And it also may reflect supply side policies that increase long-term growth. In other words, the borrowing might be the result of increased investment, particularly in infrastructure. Great point. And so many more points coming through. It's absolutely fantastic. Conscious of time here, so I'm going to go straight to my points. So these are some of the counter arguments. I'm going to unleash my inner Keynesian. As you know, I'm a Keynesian economist. So the Keynesian justification is that higher state borrowing is an essential response to recession and the risk of deflation. In fact, fiscal policy should take the place of monetary policy, especially when there's a liquidity trap. I'm not a massive fan of Sunak, but he did the right thing, in my opinion, to move quickly and allow the deficit to rise when the depth of the pandemic became clear. Point two there, a lot of students in the chat have been mentioning this. Government borrowing can fund investment, such as infrastructure. Now, you can improve that by saying, well, what type of infrastructure? That increases long and aggregate supply, which generates more tax revenues. And that's why some people are talking about crowding in. Because, of course, if the economy gets bigger, some of these projects could be self-financing, and you could crowd in the private sector, because the private sector will be bidding for investment projects to build the roads, the bridges, the new hospitals, and so on. The third point is contextual. Government borrowing is not necessarily a cause for concern if you can borrow cheaply. And at the moment, the bond yield on debt is about 1.9%. Take off inflation, it's negative. And if you have very low bond yields, that does make high borrowing more sustainable. And you could bring in a monetary policy aspect, not necessarily a cause for concern, because, of course, you've got the Bank of England now with quantitative easing, who could, in theory, buy the debt. Wow. Some good points there from GBR. No, your points were better. Just to finish off. Very quickly, taxes are going up. Just something to bear in mind as you go into the paper on Monday. The government is already starting to raise tax. It's almost as if they've made a decision. They want to they don't want to go down the fiscal austerity road that Osborne did a decade ago by cutting spending. Their preference is probably to raise tax. So I'll just very quickly go through this if it's okay with you, conscious of time here. First of all, they've frozen the income tax allowance for the next 3 years, starting this year. It's gone up to 12,500. It's going to stay at 12,500 for 3 years. And that leads to what's called fiscal drag, because as people's earnings and wages go up, they start paying more taxes. In fact, they might move from 20% to 40% tax take. Or people on low incomes might suddenly start paying taxes when they weren't paying taxes before. So fiscal drag can bring in billions. The big rise in corporation tax for larger companies, which we've mentioned, 19 to 25% over the next 6 years. Big rise in national insurance is already baked in part to pay for more social care. Welfare benefits going up, but not as much as consumer prices. So the real value of welfare probably going down. We've had suggestions of an online sales tax coming in next year. We know there's a windfall tax on the energy companies. So taxes are going up and real welfare benefits going down. Just moving on, I just think essentially, finally, I just want to say something about a debate between economists just to round off here. And this, I think this is really useful actually in terms of your paper on Monday. Now, this is a simplification, but I think it's just worthwhile being aware of this debate between the fiscal conservatives and the Keynesians. So if it's okay with you, a minute on this. Fiscal conservatives, nearly always kind of neoliberal pre-market economists, they argue that government spending and borrowing crowds out the private sector. They actually they favour a small state with low taxes and low government spending, limited welfare, and the government just providing essential public goods and so on. That's a perfectly plausible position. These are people who believe in the Laffer curve, the argument that the government should cut taxes to get more revenue. So there's a debate. Fiscal conservatives typically are afraid of high deficits, very worried about high debt, and they would tend to move more quickly to bring the deficit down. On the other hand, you have Keynesians who favour a fiscal stimulus when the economy is in a recession and also in a liquidity trap. Government borrowing is needed when the deflation risk is high, as it was in 2020. And they argue that if you get the government spending right with a strong fiscal multiplier, the effect can actually crowd in the private sector, expand the private sector, rather than crowd out. And in a nutshell, that's the two perspectives. Let me finish this session. First of all, thanking you for what you've done, but with this question. I was just trying to think of another 25 marker, just in case you wanted to have a go. And I'm actually going to write a plan for this tonight. I'll probably do a little non-live video and post it up on YouTube, probably sometime tonight or tomorrow morning. How would you deal with this question? Using a country of your choice, evaluate whether reducing a budget deficit is a desirable objective of policy. What do you reckon? That would be my question, and I'll leave that with you. Okay, fantastic responses. I'm conscious of time here. I've taken up nearly 40 minutes of your time, so I apologise for that. Cormac asks, Jeff, why are you not a Hayek economist? It's a great question. Cormac, let me just say, by the way, that I'm a big fan of the Austrian school, in particular Joseph Schumpeter. I think his work in economics is amazing. If Keynes was the greatest economist in the first half of the 20th century, I think Schumpeter has a claim to be the greatest economist of the second half of the 20th century. I'll leave a debate amongst you all as to who's the greatest living economist at the moment. Who would you put in? Put in the chat window. Who's your favourite living economist, other than Econ plus Dahl and myself? Obviously, we have to leave ourselves out of the calculation. Who do you think? Who would be your favourite living economist? Richard Thaler. Detsky says Richard Thaler. Stiglitz, Amartya Sen. Amartya Sen taught me at Cambridge many years ago, nearly 40 years ago. One of the greatest living economists, development economists of all time. Rob Buxton, can you see in the comments, Jim, do AQA need country profiles? I don't think you do actually for AQA. EdExcel, they do recommend you have a country, 2 or 3 countries that you're familiar with, because the question will often say using a country of your own choice. I think the micro paper said using a market or industry of your own choice, didn't it? Holly says, what Cambridge college did you go to, Jeff? I'm hoping you go in October. Oh, congratulations, Holly. Wow, fantastic. I went to Clare College, Cambridge. And I go back pretty much every year, actually, ahead of each teaching term at my school. I go back to Cambridge just to refresh and rejuvenate, and it's an amazing place. So good luck with that, Holly. I hope you get the grades to take you to that wonderful university. And maybe time for one more question. Jim picks these out. We've got a few people actually in the chat window who don't do economics. So my favorite. So what is the tax burden? My teacher never went through it. Okay, Alex, there's two types of tax burdens. One is the micro one, which you probably revised for paper one, which is the question of who pays a tax, like VAT. That's the micro tax burden. The macro tax burden is actually quite a simple idea. You take all the taxes that come in, all the taxes, income tax, VAT, national insurance, all those taxes together. That gives you total tax revenue, and then you just divide by GDP. So it's basically how much of the economy does the government take in tax. It's a measure of whether a country is a high or low tax economy. Many developing countries, for example, have very low tax burdens. They're not very efficient at collecting in tax revenues, and per capita incomes are very low. Okay. Oh yeah, just going to need to mention quickly our Instagram account. We are going to go gangbusters on Instagram over the next 72 hours with lots of charts and exam advice. So do check us out on Instagram, GT2 Economics. And also keep an eye, we've got a session coming up in about 20 minutes on supply side policies. And that's the last of our topic-based sessions. I'm looking forward to that. 30 minutes on supply side. Saturday is the day off, revision day. Super Sunday, 5 p.m. we have a big session on the UK. 7 p.m. we have an open mic session where we just basically field revision questions for paper 2 and do the best we can. There's a little bit of support on Sunday evening. So huge thanks for joining in. Fantastic answers today. Really appreciate it. We never take it for granted. And see you soon.